For 50 years, every gum wrapper, greasy pizza box, half-eaten sandwich, dirty diaper, old art project, unused scrap, and article of trash from the entirety of New York City was put on a ferry and discarded in an ever-growing, smelling, and rotting pile in a corner of Staten Island. For half a century, one poor neighborhood on that lesser-known island accumulated trash as Manhattan accumulated wealth. For every skyscraper that rose, the place known as Fresh Kills grew taller too, not with shiny new condos, but smelly old refuse. That was normal. It was normal for someone in Queens to dispose of their household trash in a chute that went down to the building's basement. Normal for the super to add it to the dumpster, for the dumpster to be emptied once a week into the belly of a truck, for the truck to be driven to the outskirts of the city and added to a barge, and a barge to slowly make their way past the Statue of Liberty and into the former wetlands and get unloaded onto 450 acres of what was thought to be wasted space. Normal. As in, if you lived on the Upper West Side in 1983, you probably didn't think twice about disposing of your small bag of trash a few times a week. Never wondered where it went. I'll be honest, I only sort of know where my trash goes now. It's normal, it's unnoticed. Part of the everyday fabric of assumptions and things we take for granted that make our lives what they are. From 1948, when the landfill opened, it quickly grew to become the largest landfill in the world in just 7 years. And once it was open, it was hard to close. At its peak of operation around 1991, Fresh Kills received as much as 29,000 tons of trash per day. But what seemed totally normal to someone in Queens started to be untenable for residents of Staten Island. At some point between 1948 and the 1980s, their life routines started growing smellier, and they started to notice higher rates of asthma and then cancers. Life in the neighborhoods around Fresh Kills was no longer guaranteed to be healthy or safe. And of course, long before the people noticed, the plant life suffocated, shriveled without the light of the sun and under the weight of the garbage. As the wetlands filled in, fish, frogs, and other life were gagged, poisoned by the polluted waters and pushed out by the piles of trash. Birds found no nesting places, no food for their journeys, no more audience for their songs. That normal, too, was extinguished. We come into Easter morning at the tomb. We come with the echoes of Good Friday still in our ears. We come from a world in which death is the norm. Death is normal, not just in the sense that every living being will one day eventually die, but the particular kind of death that is dealt by empires to maintain their power. The cruel and unusual deaths of crucifixion, of war, of starvation, those that ruled first-century Judea and those we witness today in Ukraine, in the Holy Land, and in our own country. The old normal was one where crucifixion was not rare but expected for those who came to be seen as enemies of the empire, where the roads leading into town were marked by crosses to remind sojourners whose streets these were, where ordinary people were taxed into starvation and worship was not a matter of personal belief, but loyalty to the rulers and their gods that was demanded in order to live safely under the Pax Romana. Peace would have been a laughable concept to Jewish peasants, who by the time John's Gospel was written had not only lived under the thumb of Rome, but had seen their beloved city and temple obliterated, whose connection to their ancestral religion was entirely up in the air because the norm of temple sacrifice and worship was extinguished with the fall of Jerusalem. In John's Gospel, the Passion narrative is a reversal of the creation narratives. We have witnessed over the last 4 days the Garden of Eden become the Garden of Gethsemane. The tree of the knowledge of good and evil reduced to boards for a cross. Instead of life being expanded from the rib of Adam, Jesus' side is pierced, adding injury to death. What began with the word of God has ended with the words of Christ. It is finished. And yet, just as there was morning and there was evening that first day, dawn came again, and Mary rose to meet it. Mary's discovery of an empty tomb in the garden early that Sunday morning is the point where the normalcy of death, the preeminence of the Good Friday world, run headlong into a strange and unsettling post-normal moment. Her discovery ushered in a period of disruption and tumult that upended the norms, routines, and expectations of much of the world, and which we are still adapting to. When the male disciples arrive on the scene that morning at the tomb, they realize that something is amiss. They realize that this is not a normal tomb, a normal visit to a grave. But they don't stay present long enough to witness the resurrection. It's only Mary, according to John, who stays present enough to her grief, who allows her tears to fall, and who demands over and over again the answer to her question, "Where have they taken my Lord?" And only to her that Jesus first appears. We can understand the events of that Sunday as a signal to the readers of John's gospel that the period of normalcy had ended. We have entered a post-normal time. And we might know something about that too. While we talk about longing for a new normal, we know that on or around March 15th, 2020, we ceased living in normal times and had entered a post-normal reality. The norms, routines, and expectations we had for our lives and our world were suddenly disrupted. And this time it wasn't a disruption just for one person or a group of people or even country, but the entire world. March 2020 was one of those events that happen about once a generation that upend what we consider to be normal and usher in a period of transition and tumult before the adaptations and changes from that period become a new normal. The concept of post-normality may also be like a kairos moment, a moment in which God's inbreaking is most apparent. As Paul Tillich described, it is a crucial moment in which humanity must make an existential decision about our relationship to God's actions and to one another. It is the appointed time to speak for liberation. And at this kairos moment of the Easter story, there is one person who speaks into that strange silence of that morning. Mary asks over and over, "Where have they taken her Lord?" And then, through the cloudy veil of tears, she thinks she sees a gardener. It may seem like a random or trivial detail, or it may seem ludicrous or unimportant, but what if Mary wasn't mistaken? John starts his gospel hearkening back to the beginning of creation in Genesis, sets a garden as the scene for Jesus' arrest, takes pains to explain why Jesus' tomb would be in a garden rather than another burial place. John uses the motif of Jesus as a new Adam and the resurrection as a moment when God breathes into being a new creation. Uses this particular moment in history to mark the end of the old normal and the beginning of new creation. In the midst of a place where you would expect one to be digging graves, comes a figure she assumes is planting new life. Expecting soldiers with spears, she imagines instead a gardener. The motif of God creating a new heaven and new earth is repeated throughout our scriptures, from Isaiah's prophetic words at the time of the Babylonian exile, when the Hebrew people were cast out of their land, to the century after Jesus' death, when the readers of John's gospel and early church were struggling to make some major adaptations to the tumult they were living through. So often we use daffodils, baby bunnies, chicks, eggs, and signs of spring to represent the Easter story. New life is inevitable, we seem to say. Just as the sun rises in the morning and the crocuses come up in March, resurrection is normal. But all that stuff is inevitable. It's not normal. It is normal. Like the seasons, it is dependable and predictable, and resurrection surely is not. Resurrection is what happens when God's love breaks into a surreal moment and opens a way for a new normal to emerge. In 1991, the residents of Staten Island began to fight for the closure of that landfill. Using the new Clean Air Act legislation, they brought a lawsuit in 1996 that argued that because Staten Island had more poor and black residents than on average the rest of New York City, the placement of the landfill there was discriminatory. They won that lawsuit, and later that year, the state required that they begin the closure of the landfill. So slowly, and eventually, the site went from trash heap to remediation site. The refuse piles were capped, and the gas emitted from the site is now used to create renewable energy. On top of the capped mountains of trash, native plants and grasses now grow. Slowly, bugs and birds have begun to return, bringing life into a place where there had been none for over half a century. The park still won't be open to the public for a decade, but the seeds of change are already blooming. And isn't that resurrection? Resurrection is not about celebrating the inevitable cycle of life as much as it's about choosing to take a moment in which those cycles have been interrupted to create a more abundant life out of the disruption. Resurrection is less like daffodils and more like fresh kills. Resurrection happens when the tears of grief commingle with God's renewing love, and we are attentive enough to notice. Perhaps it is only when we have been interrupted by the grief of death, when we mourn that which has been lost or killed by the powers and principalities of the world, when we can shake ourselves loose from the routines and normalcy of our lives to practice resurrection, when there is enough space for God's inbreaking into the world to be noticed, where God can cultivate something new. In the midst of our own post-normal moment, this Kairos time in which we find ourselves, we will have to imagine ourselves into a new age of normalcy. With Jesus' ethical compass and a broad imagination open to God's guiding spirit, because while daffodils may bloom year after year where they have been planted, it takes some real muscle and investment to replant life where it has been extinguished. The resurrected Jesus entrusted Mary to pronounce about a world beyond the existential post-normal. The hope of a new world is at the core of the proclamation entrusted upon Mary and entrusted upon us. On Easter, we are reminded that everywhere the normality of death and evil is being chipped away, there God's love is at work. And we are invited to participate in the transformation of the old world to the new. There is much to grieve. So many places where it feels still like Good Friday and less like Easter. Our planet is in peril. Lives from Tonga to New Mexico every day upended by climate change. War fueled by imperialism and greed and complicated by the globe's dependence on fossil fuels. Joanna Macy writes that until we can grieve for our planet, we cannot love it. Grieving is a sign of spiritual health. But it is not enough to weep for lost landscapes. We have to put our hands in the earth to make ourselves whole again. Even a wounded world is feeding us. Even a wounded world holds us, giving us moments of wonder and joy. We can choose joy over despair. Not because we have our heads in the sand, but because joy is what the earth gives us daily, and we must return the gift. And the joy and hope of Easter is that in the midst of grief, the renewal of the choice to embrace our role as stewards and cultivators of life, the renewal of our relationship with all of creation. Mary was not mistaken. the first to proclaim, I have seen the Lord, and the first to see Christ's new old purpose, restorer of the land. With grief for what has been lost and hope for all that can grow, may we become a part of God's resurrecting work, making all creation new. Christ is risen indeed. Amen.